for potentially your blog post or something like that. There is a link in this document as well. It's filmsite.org/docfilms. This website used to be free of ads, but now it's filled with ads. I do think it's helpful, especially if you're trying to find a certain kind of documentary. Like, I'm going to assign you 2 documentaries to watch, but it's up to you to decide which specific documentaries you want to choose. And if you have no idea, like I say, you need to find an expose documentary and you're not familiar with anything like that, you can hop in here and find some stuff. Here we go, expose including interviews. There's a bunch of them here that you could potentially choose. Okay. So let's start off with what a documentary is. Usually when we're in the in-person version of the class, I ask you all to look up on Google what a documentary is. Google's not great for that. Generally, Google says of or consisting of documents, which is not what we think of when we think about a documentary film. If you search for documentary film instead, you'll find something a little bit closer to what we think of as a documentary. But what is the literal definition of a documentary? Well, it's this right here, pulled straight from Wikipedia. A documentary film, often described simply as a documentary, is a non-fiction motion picture intended to document reality, primarily for instruction, education, or maintaining a historical record. Is that exactly accurate? In most cases, yes, right? So the big thing that we need to pull from this is it's non-fiction film. So if we think about what a novel, that's fiction, versus a textbook, which is nonfiction. So I guess that's kind of the equivalent for our films, right? The textbook version of films is documentary, whereas the narrative version of films is your Marvel film, right? But there are differences. I mean, that's a very boiled down version of the definition. If we think about documentaries that we've seen before, they're not just like a textbook. They have interviews, and sometimes in those interviews, people get very upset or very emotional, and they engage with us emotionally, which we don't really expect textbooks to do. So what is a documentary? Chances are you had something in your mind when you heard the word documentary, and that's usually some kind of interview. A person sits down in a chair and tells their life story, or tells the story about somebody else, and that's intercut with snippets from that person's life. That's usually what we kind of think of with a documentary. So there are these connotative definitions, the connotative meaning, the thing that you think of when you first hear the word documentary. But if you did think that sit-down interview type thing, do all documentaries have that? Certainly not. If you think of a nature documentary, if you've ever seen a documentary on sharks or the Alaskan tundra, chances are there's some kind of voiceover narration about what's happening, and then animals doing something. It's not animals sitting down a chair telling us how their life unfolded. Likewise, there are plenty of historical documentaries where no one from that time period is even alive. There may be interviews, but those interviews would be done with historians. Buck the trend of what you think of when you think of the most popular documentaries of all time, where someone's telling you about their experience. Super Size Me, most people are familiar with that one. Morgan Spurlock's experience eating McDonald's foods for an extended period of time and the harm that that did on his body. He's actively going through that stuff, but also interviewing himself along the way. Okay, so let's talk about bias and nonfiction. Bias, I think, is really important, especially with documentary films, because they are presented as objective. They're presented as a document of reality. In almost all cases, that is accurate. Something real did happen. If something real didn't happen and it's presented as a documentary, we call it a fake documentary. It looks like one, but it didn't really happen. How does bias seep into this stuff? Bias is everywhere. You have a bias on almost everything. Anything that you have an opinion on, you could be biased toward or against something based on your life experience. If you don't have much of a bias, you probably don't know much about the subject at hand. This certainly applies to filmmakers, and there are two kinds of biases that I really want to highlight here. That is implicit bias and explicit bias. Implicit bias means that you have some kind of bias that you're not really completely aware of. For example, I am kind of a humanist, so I am drawn to human stories, and I think a lot of people are similar to me. I think that people are really important in the world, but that is a bias I have, and a bias that not everyone shares with me, and it's something that I expect everybody that I talk to share that same bias with me so that we're all on the same page. But that's not necessarily a fact. Now, on the other side of things is an explicit bias, which is a bias that is known about by the subject. An explicit bias can often appear in a documentary or a textbook in a way that avoids things that would complicate the issue or draw criticism to the issue, and then amplify things that support the issue. So if you really think that the American military is the best military in the world, which you can make an argument for, anything that supports that argument, you probably want to include in your documentary. And anything that would challenge the argument, you may leave out even if you know that it exists. So that would be an example of an explicit bias. So I asked the question here, is it possible for a film to be unbiased? Any film? And the answer is obviously not, because films are made by people, and people are either implicitly or explicitly biased toward whatever subject they're making a documentary or narrative film about. One extra little bit here. Explicit bias. These things exist on a spectrum. There are some films out there that I certainly can't say, is this explicitly biased or implicitly biased? It's somewhere in between. It appears that most things are just an implicit bias that the filmmaker had. A couple of things lead me to believe that there are some explicit biases in the film as well. On the far end of the spectrum, on the end of explicit bias, is propaganda. If you've ever heard of propaganda films or just propaganda in general, you've almost certainly seen some in your everyday life. What is propaganda? It's not just extremely explicitly biased. There are other qualifiers, and that is a clear call to action. A clear call to action just means that the film or piece of media is trying to get you to do something. They want you to go out and vote, or they want you to go out and not vote. Both of those things would be a call to action, even the not voting thing. And then, does that call to action conflict with the person's own best interests? So a good example that most people would recognize from U.S. history is the Uncle Sam posters, "I want you for the U.S. Army." Most people are familiar with the patriotic guy that's trying to get you to join the Army. Now, is it in your own best interest to join the Army at a time of war? Probably not. Is there a call to action? Absolutely. They are trying to get you to join the Army. With those two things in mind, there's an explicit bias and a clear call to action that is not in your best interest. That would qualify as a piece of propaganda. Propaganda can appear as documentary films or even narrative films. In this case, we'll talk about documentaries. A good example of propaganda in documentary film is Triumph of the Will. That documentary was partially responsible for the rise of Hitler in Germany before World War II. This is an option for you to watch in this class for one of your documentary films, but not a requirement. If that doesn't seem like something you can watch objectively, you can certainly pick something else. Let's talk about some other kinds of documentary stuff. Documentary conventions, that just means things that are oftentimes in documentaries. Interviews, we talked about that already. That basically means a person sits in front of a camera and tells a story about whatever the documentary is about. With a documentary, you usually think about these things as being about 2 hours long, unless it's a whole series. Even if it was a whole series, you still have relatively few interview subjects. So it's just a handful of people trying to tell you about this thing that happened. Sometimes that works if it's a small story, but if it's a documentary about World War II, which is humongous, and you have 5 people telling you about World War II, that falls under a limited scope. There's not that many different perspectives on the situation to really give you a clear idea of what happened. You can get a cursory idea of what happened, but not in depth and know for sure what happened during World War II. Stock footage that is often in documentary films, and I'm just going to add something here, in archival footage, because you'll see both and they're somewhat similar, but they are different, right? Stock footage means generic footage. So if a character in a documentary says, and then we move to New York City, and we see shots that are maybe like overhead drone shots or helicopter shots of the city of New York that were not filmed by the filmmakers, that would qualify as stock footage. That's just footage shot by somebody else that is then reappropriated to help tell a story. Okay. Archival footage is also shot by somebody else, but it's much more specific. If we happen to say, and then we move to New York City, and there's home video footage of my time as a child in New York City, that would be archival footage. Likewise, if we were doing a documentary about Walmart and used some training footage from Walmart, that would also be archival footage. The big difference between these two things is one is specific, that being archival footage, and one is generic, that being stock footage. But both oftentimes appear inside documentaries. Another documentary convention is statistics. You probably know what statistics are, facts and figures. So if you see a chart or a line chart inside a documentary, that would certainly be statistics. If someone simply says a statistic, 50% of all people experienced this phenomena, that would be a statistic as well. And how these things are generally cherry-picked are through interviews. So if you ever see an interview where someone says a particular statistic, these things can oftentimes be misquoted in the moment when someone's talking. Rather than the filmmakers correcting that, they include it if it supports their argument. This is a really troublesome thing that I see in a lot of documentaries, and something that makes me feel like a documentary is explicitly biased. We see films where every tiny detail is crafted by several people. There are so many filters that it's hard to believe that if someone is really off on a statistic, that that thing slipped through all those filters and was just an accident on the filmmaker's part. Some things may be an implicit bias where the statistic is just slightly off and appears to be benign to the filmmaker and they let it slide that way. Or the statistic is dramatically off and the filmmakers let it slide anyway because they say that these people are experts in some capacity. That's always something to look out for with documentaries in particular. Another documentary convention is narration, and we can see narration presented in various forms. We oftentimes think of a nature documentary like March of the Penguins, where someone's saying what's happening over the actual video. But we can also see that over archival footage with interviews, so we can get an idea of what actually happened in that archival footage. If I present to you my home movies from when I'm 3 years old, you might not be able to tell that this is a video of my birthday and I was 3 years old when this thing happened to me, unless I tell you that specifically. And maybe I said that stuff in an interview, but how the documentary presents itself is that interview is reappropriated into narration. Now, how narration could get bias injected into it, it's usually the voice of the filmmaker. Whatever the filmmaker intends to say explicitly to you, that usually comes through narration, if narration is present in the actual documentary. Narration can be relatively benign if filmmakers are trying to present an objective story, but it can be kind of troublesome too if people are trying to tell a story that isn't exactly aligned with reality. For example, many nature documentaries will present the life of an animal from its birth until adulthood and various trials in between. A lot of these things are completely fabricated. They almost work like stock footage. You see the monkey as a baby, and then you see a monkey in a tree almost get eaten by a snake. Is that the same monkey that was the baby before? Probably not. But film in general lends itself well to storytelling and emotional response from its audience. So we do see significant differences between nonfiction and film and the written word. Exposition delivery, what that means is how is the story presented to us, right? How is the exposition delivered? So if you've ever heard of expositional dialogue, that's a thing that most people don't like in a narrative film, meaning that two people sit down and talk about what happened. What we care to see usually is the thing actually happening, right? Show, don't tell is the big rule within narrative film. Now, that does not necessarily apply to documentaries. One, because the documentarians may not have been present for the thing that actually happened, and unless they want to do some kind of recreation, they can't show it visually. And instead, what holds more weight is someone who actually experienced it telling us what happened. How exposition delivery happens in documentaries generally is common themes and concepts are introduced early and directly. It's much like an academic paper. If you have ever done one of those before, you'll know that there's a thesis statement that's required, and that thesis statement goes in the introduction of your paper. You want to introduce what the theme is, what's going to happen in this documentary very early, so then everything that comes after reinforces that. It's not like a narrative film that may have some kind of mystery about what's going on. That's very rare to see in documentary films. And if it is there in a documentary film, that film is probably pretty emotionally manipulative. And that's okay in certain situations, but in other ones where you hope that the film will be as unbiased as possible, that is not something you would really want to see. All right, let's talk about documentary subjects. And some of these things we've already talked about and how bias can slip into these things. Nature documentaries, we did talk about that with bias, but there are a couple examples here that I think are interesting. Microcosmos, which I would highly recommend if you've not seen before. A really interesting nature documentary. Planet Earth series is good too. Not something that I'd recommend for this class specifically, since it's a whole series of documentaries, but something in that vein would probably be good. Live performance or concerts. Now, you might not even think about this as a documentary, but it certainly is. Watch a concert for the band U2, a band that's been around for a long time. They have plenty of concerts that have been recorded, edited, and then presented as some kind of film. How can bias form there? It's a live performance. It's a real document of what actually happened. There are plenty of times that biases can slip in through editing, through cinematography, through various ways. As an editor, I think that the lead singer of U2 is really important, so I'm going to focus on him more than other people. That would be my bias affecting the art form. Likewise, if I was a drummer and an editor and I gave more screen time to the drummer because I like the drums, that would certainly be an implicit bias that I'm injecting into my documentary. So those things, again, relatively benign. They don't really give you a call to action to act against your own best interests, so probably not propaganda at that point, but bias certainly present. Exposés exist to expose something bad within society, right? Big exposés are Super Size Me, exposing the McDonald's diet, which was a thing that was actually advertised back in the day. Now I think everyone can agree that McDonald's is not the most healthy food in the world. That was not always the consensus idea, so Super Size Me made a change to society. The Last Great Disgrace was a short documentary about mental hospitals in the United States and how people were neglected and uncared for. It was really eye-opening at the time. It's an older documentary with Geraldo Rivera, who's not got the greatest reputation today, but at the time he did pretty impressive feat with that particular documentary. Informational documentaries are also a documentary subject. Videos that you may see explaining how to do something, tutorial videos, those are informational documentaries. So entirely within the umbrella of documentary, probably not the most interesting ones in the world, and there are certainly biases there, and sometimes outright propaganda. For example, I worked at Walmart once upon a time, and in the middle of all of these industrial videos teaching you how to pick things up properly to not hurt your back, there came a piece of propaganda that said you may be approached by a union representative to form a union. And what that would mean for Walmart, that would mean that your friends and coworkers would be fired and all this bad stuff would happen to the business. Clearly a propaganda thing going on there, right? They don't want you to join a union, so you'll do what's in their best interests rather than yours. Other documentary subjects, historical documentaries, things about the past or pieces of history. Night and Fog is a very famous one, also very depressing if you decide to go that route. Finally, experimental documentaries, which usually challenge the conventions that we saw earlier with interviews and B-roll, which is basically shots outside of the interviews that help reinforce things. Also archival footage and stuff. So Man with a Movie Camera has none of those. It has no sort of interview. It has no real narrative structure other than it is slice of life stuff happening in Soviet Union at the time, mixed with Industrial Revolution, things that were happening at the time in other places too, and then also mixed with the creation of the actual film. So we get plenty of shots of the man with the movie camera, as well as shots of the film's first exhibition in a theater, as well as shots of the film being cut together, like physically edited. Challenging of the form is usually what we see with an experimental film. Where people get a little bit confused is if there is an experiment within the film, that does not mean it is experimental. Super Size Me Again, he performs an experiment over the course of the entire film. What happens if I eat McDonald's food every day for an extended period of time? That is not an experimental documentary. Instead, an experimental documentary experiments with the nature of film or with the nature of documentary film. Finally, there are some things that are not documentaries at all, but have the feeling of documentaries. Those are faux documentaries or fake documentaries. Mondo Cane, which is mentioned in the URL at the beginning of the presentation, is a fake documentary. It appears as though there's these really awful things happening in it, but those things are faked. The opening of Citizen Kane is also usually equated with a fake documentary. At the time that Citizen Kane came out, they had what were called newsreels, which were like the original documentaries. Since people didn't have TVs in their homes at the time, they didn't have their local nightly news. Instead, they went to a movie theater, and before the movie showed, you would see a little newsreel of what's going on in the world and what's going on in the United States before the film actually started. So the opening of Citizen Kane is presented as one of these newsreels. It was sort of confusing for people at the time. Like, is this a real thing or is it not? Nowadays, if you watch it, it really feels clear that it's part of the narrative. But there are other fake documentaries out there. I'm kind of fond of this horror film called Lake Mungo that is a fake documentary. The entire movie is presented as though it's a documentary, although all of the elements of the film are fabricated. It's not real interviews, it's actors presented as real life people. It works really, really well, but not actually a documentary. It's a fake. Documentaries are kind of like fake documentaries too, but these things are done for comedy. So this is Spinal Tap, a mockumentary. There's going to be a second Spinal Tap movie with these old guys now. Also, a lot of TV shows are under that mockumentary umbrella. If you've ever seen The Office or Parks and Recreation, those things are presented as documentaries. There's a documentary crew in this workspace just filming what's happening. Now, there's this other category called cinema verite, which you may notice in lots of narrative films that are intended to feel realistic. If you've ever seen a big budget shot on a soundstage kind of film, like a Marvel or a DC movie, there's rarely going to be any kind of cinema verite style stuff going on there, but every once in a while even those would have it. But more likely you'll see cinema verite in dramas where the camera is handheld, maybe the focus on the camera isn't spot on, like it goes a little bit out of focus for a second, then the camera focuses, and it feels like you're really in the moment. That's the idea of cinema verite. All of these techniques are borrowed from documentary in general. That is, that people feel like something feels more real if it's presented in the same way that documentary films are presented. There are a couple more things I just want to kind of note. We already talked a little bit about how documentaries are similar to research papers. They require research and reporting. One more thing I want to talk about before we conclude this lesson is sources. Sources appear both in documentary films generally, as well as research papers, which you'll be doing toward the end of the class. If you've ever done a research paper before, you're probably familiar with primary and secondary sources. If you have a basic understanding of what these things are, chances are you think that primary sources are better than secondary sources, which is sometimes the case, but not always. Primary sources, what are they? They are the sources of information that are closest to the event or whatever you're actually researching. So as a good example, I have something for what could be potentially a final paper, the differences between a novel and the film adaptation. A primary source would be the actual novel and the films that are associated with whatever franchise you're looking at. Secondary sources for this sort of thing would be interviews with the author, publisher, filmmakers, and articles analyzing the text or film, since you have both books and movies with this particular area of study. Tertiary sources, which you may not be familiar with just yet. Tertiary sources are collections of primary and secondary sources. The thing that people are most familiar with is just Wikipedia or encyclopedias in general. They have a large collection of sources, but also potentially your paper or another person's paper, right? You get to the end of the paper, you see a works cited page with a bunch of sources there. That would be a tertiary source, a collection of secondary sources. And now, which of these things is more important? I think it's a little subjective, and it depends on what you're actually studying. The novel and the film can be pretty important in this situation, but also the interviews with the author and publisher and filmmakers, all that stuff, also really important. Depending on what you're researching, you may find that your secondary sources are more helpful than the primary sources themselves, but both are certainly helpful for your final paper. Tertiary sources, on the other hand, can be helpful for research, but not something you want to really include in your final paper. You can go to the bibliography or works cited page on Wikipedia or another paper and find those secondary sources, trace them back to their original source, and then use that, right? The problem with tertiary sources generally is that there's another layer of filtering and interpretation. If you quote the tertiary source, you may have problems with either a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of the actual quote. Now I'm going to give you a secondary example because all this stuff applies to documentaries as well. If the documentary subject is killer whale attacks at SeaWorld, there's a documentary called Blackfish, which you're more than welcome to watch for this class. Now, if that is the subject, what would be the primary source for that subject? In the case of Blackfish, the actual film, the primary source is archival footage of the actual attacks. Some documentaries don't have primary sources, they just don't have access to it. Other times they do, and they'll appear in various forms. It could be an interview, some archival footage from an event that happened, photos, anything, depending on what the actual subject of the documentary is. So in the case of Morgan Spurlock's Super Size Me, we have the primary sources of information, the actual interviews with Morgan Spurlock as he's doing this experiment on himself, as well as footage in the field where he's eating McDonald's. So those would be primary sources of information because it's happening in real time and the filmmakers are capturing it. Most of the time the event has already happened and the documentary retells the story. So secondary sources with this particular documentary subject, witness accounts and expert testimony, and these things are incredibly important and helpful to understand what's going on in the archival footage in the case of Blackfish. You have some home video footage of a killer whale attack. You can kind of tell what's going on, but you don't have any idea of what's going on under the surface or what the person's thinking in the moment. Those gaps are filled in by witness accounts, expert testimony, and people that were actually there. Tertiary sources on the documentary Blackfish, the only one that you can really sort of claim is the documentary itself. The documentary is a collection of secondary and primary sources, and just like our Wikipedia Britannica or another person's paper, there's a lot of filtering of information, there's a lot of editing. Whether or not you can trust this documentary is debatable. What would be much more objective is actually looking at the archival footage in its entirety on its own, rather than have someone explain what's going on and what someone's feeling and misrepresent what is happening. So that's all I have for you on documentaries this week. You do have some homework. You have to watch a documentary film. I'll have listed 2 documentary subjects as well as some suggested films and potentially links. Also, you'll have to create your film blog. That's where you'll be writing about each of our subjects and one of choice of films that you'll have to watch in the class. And then finally, we'll have a discussion post published on Brightspace, and it's something incredibly easy and subjective for you. All you have to do is tell me why you chose the film that you chose to watch. Incredibly simple, easy points. Make sure that you get them. It's just a simple paragraph telling me why. Now, if you're confused about the blog thing, I have another video that breaks down how to create a blog. It's straightforward and simple to do, especially if you have a Google account. If you're already familiar with doing those things and you want to skip that stuff, you create your blog on your own and submit your URL, that's fine. If you've never done it before, I recommend checking out that video. Good luck this week, and I will see you next week with some more stuff about documentaries.